Hey, very good morning to you. Welcome back to PRBites, the public relations podcast. And this is me once again reading the newsletter that I put out a couple of times a week, once or twice a week. So let me do that for you. There's a couple of things that I wanted to cover today. The first one was tackling the web of influence when your organization gets criticized. Quite an interesting story that a guest on the podcast shared with me that they're actually involved with. Or indeed using the web of influence to your advantage. Anyway, I'll talk about that in a second. Some stats on how people discover content and why follower count isn't a vanity metric and is actually really crucial, according to one commentator. Also, I just wanted to mention, though, before I get into those, that I'm going to be launching Comms Question Time this week. That's the spin-off show from the Public Relations podcast. And I think you are going to find this one really quite interesting because if you haven't heard about it yet, and I know I've talked about it a lot, I reached out to businesses and people who are curious about comms, folks interested in the potential of public relations, in other words, like you are, and asked them what questions or scenarios they're facing. And then I put it in front of a panel of PR experts to ask how they would tackle them. So if you're in comms, I think you're going to find it really interesting because you'll hear how others would approach a problem. And maybe you'll have your own opinions from it too. Or if you're in some organization, maybe you're part of a marketing department and you're learning a bit about PR, then it is going to be a great way of learning about that too. Because their pilot shows are going to be releasing all 3 episodes on Thursday. So I'm going to have another episode of the Public Relations podcast that day, so I'll remind you about that. But you can head to the website, which is literally called commsquestiontime.com, commsquestiontime.com. Click on the listen button on there, and it will give you the links to all the major podcast apps and how to get that set up so that you can hear those shows when they come out. I think you're going to find it really quite complimentary on top of the Public Relations podcast. Right, let's talk about the stuff that I wanted to talk about today. And the first one is probably the big one of this week, I think. And that's the importance of navigating media perceptions and building strong relationships and understanding where influence is coming from. And I think, depending on how large the brand or organization is that you're representing, comms can be a lot more complex than obviously simply crafting a compelling story and pitching to journalists, especially if you're working in an area where there is any chance of controversy. And obviously that covers a lot of comms. If you're working in that sort of area, the reality is that the media narratives and public perception can be shaped by layers of influence, relationships, and biases that can be quite difficult to navigate at times. And understanding these dynamics and how they form can get you out of trouble, ensure your story is heard, or get your story heard in the first place. Obviously, we all have preconceived ideas. Of course we all do. We all have biases and we all have things that we prefer. And, it's no different with a journalist, an influencer, or the public as a whole. Who we talk to, or more importantly, who we get our information from, can have a big impact on the story that we are going to put across. And that is just as applicable if you're a journalist, an influencer, or whoever. So, for instance, there is this interesting case that was brought up by one of my guests on the podcast, that they're currently working with this overall campaign group to try and question this story. And in this specific industry, they feel like they've been really unfairly treated by a major national newspaper in the United States. And when they started doing investigations into who the reporters were that covered this story and how they got their information, they found what frankly looked like a diagram from one of those kind of crime shows, showing where that information had come from, the different groups who were involved, who had been involved with the journalists, where the information had come from, and all this kind of thing. What lobbying organizations were involved in that, and how this side, at least, this side of the argument, were claiming that the story was biased against them and how that had formed. And in this particular case, they claimed that the freelance reporter who covered the story had connections to these lobbying organizations who advocated for one particular point of view. Now, as I always try to do on this show, I try to be as objective as possible. And so, one of the problems with journalism today is that freelancers, newsrooms, journalists are working on very tight budgets and have very little time to try and understand often very complex stories. And when you have little time, it is hard for your personal biases not to get into something. Whether you agree that's the right perspective or not. Often the opportunity to go and cover a story, particularly if it's abroad and someone else is offering you a free trip, is very tempting because it's going to make a story that is more interesting and it's going to sound more authoritative. It's certainly something you're going to more easily be able to pitch to an editor. And it's not necessarily unethical, of course, to take an offer like that, to go on a trip. I mean, I've done that before. But it's obviously got the potential to influence the narrative. It's going to be very hard, for instance, if you're a showbiz reporter invited to a gorgeous location to interview some movie stars and talk about a movie, to then come back and criticize that movie. In the same respect, if someone invites you to come along to an interesting location to hear about something that you're interested in, whatever a topic, and they pay the bill for you to go and show you all the photos, give you all the information, put everything on a plate that you need to be able to write your story in a really easy way, it is very hard to turn that down. And then it's very hard in that situation to then go on that trip and then say about the people who gave you the trip that they were talking a lot of rubbish and criticize them. It's not that it doesn't happen. It's just that it's human nature to tend to not want to criticize those people who've just given you something. So in this case, the industry that we're talking about with my guest, they said that the reporters were funded to visit a particular organization, a series of organizations, and I get a particular perspective. So they got information, statistics, and access to resources, but from one side of the argument. And as a result, the industry in question feel that the journalist has not represented their perspective, as the reporter has primarily relied on sources tied to these different lobbying and campaigning groups. And of course, this isn't just a one-off case. This kind of thing goes on all the time in particularly big issue politics. There are all kinds of different disparate groups who are pushing for different points of view, and at times they will work together and make their story far more effective. So there's often lots of layers at play with many stories and public perception. So that's the kind of basics. But how can you use this? What can you learn from it? I think there's two perspectives. Firstly, if you're on the receiving end of this, don't just immediately assume that a journalist doesn't like you. When facing negative coverage, look beyond the surface. Don't just assume that reporter has it in for you. Think about who is really behind the story. Where is the influence coming from? And where did the reporter get their information? While this might sound like work, think about it this way. If you have got a really tough job of trying to get your side of the argument across, or even being heard, and there's momentum against you, then simply piecing together, almost like this web of different organizations like a crime novel, you can start to understand the motivations and the affiliations of the journalists and the organization or the influencers or whatever, and then you can see how they're potentially biased. And in some cases, by bringing into question the credibility of the story, by providing this, asking the editor and say, look, has this all been fully covered properly? And can we have our side? Because we can see that this was very much put just by one side. It could help to kill a story or at least diminish its effects afterwards by questioning the reporting or questioning the source of those comments that are being put out. One thing that you see happen in the world of political PR, for example, is that if a reporter is about to release a story that a politician doesn't like, often the PR people within that political party will contact that journalist and try to discredit the story, undermine it, raise questions about its credibility and doubts about it. And if they can't do it that way, then they might start to point out, well, this simply isn't true. Or, and if it doesn't even work that way, certainly with people like Alistair Campbell, who was a very well-known, was known as a spin doctor in UK politics, was pretty aggressive. Or, that PR person might well offer them a story in return for dropping the other story, as long as they get exclusive access to X or whatever it is. So the question you want to be asking then is that if you're on the defense, is who is putting this information out there? And how are they working together with others to shape this narrative? And by understanding this, you can question the accuracy of the story and present your side in a way that brings balance to that coverage. Whether we like it or not, people are basically looking for their own ideas to be reinforced most of the time. But if we have the opportunity to provide another point of view, to give a different side of it, then at least there's a chance that you're going to be heard and help to actually add more balance to that coverage. But remember, this isn't just about being on the receiving end of this. This is also about using this to your advantage as well, if you're not doing this already. And to do that, it is about, look, if we reverse this, while it's tempting to treat PR as this kind of transactional process, sending a press release and hoping for the best, real impact comes from building partnerships, not just sending a press release. Some of it is obvious, like just, getting to know the journalist so that you can contact them and they're not just going to ignore you. But it's also about looking for that unique, well-packaged story that can help them stand out in their careers too. What trips can you take them on? What exclusive access can you give them? Whether it's inside a factory or taking them abroad, it doesn't really matter. They're less likely to criticize you if you've done something for them that is really helpful and useful. So what facts and figures can you give them in an easy-to-understand way, helping to get them on your side? One powerful example of this comes from Opus Dei, which was a real-life organization portrayed in Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. And rather than retreat in the face of negative press and people thinking that the story was true and The characters in it were all out to get people and these secret societies and all this kind of thing. They embraced the situation, and they actually had a spokesperson that appeared on numerous media outlets explaining and clarifying their stance in a way that humanized the organization. Another organization could have got defensive, but instead they put themselves forward with things like, even like watching clips from the Da Vinci Code and laughing, much like those YouTube videos where scientists discredit a sci-fi movie by saying that could never happen. They would sort of laugh at it and go, that could never happen in this particular way. What people do is this. And in doing so, by coming forward and by giving content and by giving comments on a plate to journalists, they humanized the whole issue and turned potentially very harmful publicity into a PR opportunity. Sure, lots of people would have heard the Dan Brown version and never heard their point of view, but by countering, they at least managed to get their point of view across to some people. The final point I think is worth saying from this is that if you're sending a press release with your opinion on something, it is just you. If you're trying to counter something, it's just your voice, and that's easy to ignore. But what you can see here in this particular example I'm talking about with the guests is in this particular campaign, you've got on the side that have worked with the journalists, I think it's about sort of 8, 10 different organizations, all aligned with that particular point of view that have come together to lobby for one point of view. And that just shows the power of multiple voices. So if you're trying to shift public opinion or influence opinion or get your point of view across, simply putting your own voice forward may not be enough. But putting forward multiple voices, when you've got 10 different voices all saying your side of the argument, which hasn't been covered, it gets harder and harder to ignore that. So having strong partnerships with lots of different organizations is a powerful technique as well. I think partnerships are sometimes something people forget in PR because they're so focused on sending out press releases or stories. But what's the ultimate goal here? Is it to send a press release, or is it to achieve a change in the overall message that the public are hearing, or the people that you're trying to reach? So I think to sum all this up, it is easy to think that PR and comms are just about putting out a story and hoping that people will cover it. But if you're under attack, or if you're trying to influence a narrative, and there's a barrier to that and a difficulty to that, then be aware of the depth of the story if it's criticism against you, or create the same depth on your side when trying to put across your point of view. And that way, by delivering a message in a nice, clean way to journalists, influence, and whatever, you've got more chance of being heard and influencing the narrative, however strong that might be. Right, there were 2 other quick stories that I was just going to cover, and I've covered these in the newsletter. As always with all this stuff, I put the links in the written newsletter. So if you want to subscribe to that, just go to the publicrelationspodcast.com and click on the newsletter link, and you can get the written version. Also, you don't have to listen to me rabbiting away as I read the newsletter. You can actually just skim through this stuff. So 2 other stories I spotted. An interesting one I came across on LinkedIn, and a social media manager there was saying that we should stop criticizing the idea that follower count is just a vanity metric and doesn't matter. Sure, having lots of followers doesn't necessarily mean there's engagement or that people are actually doing anything as a result of your content, but at the same time, it is a social validation marker. People can't help but notice it, whether it's valid or not. And if they see you've got lots of followers and think, okay, maybe I should pay attention to what this person is saying because they've got lots of followers. So while a big follower count might not directly drive the action you want, it does still mean that more people are going to look at your content and by extension, see that call to action. So follower count isn't just vanity metric. And the second point was a fascinating piece by Tom Webster, who's an absolute podcasting guru and really sharp when it comes to data and understanding how things actually work. And he pointed out something interesting. If you're making a podcast to boost a brand or trying to get people to hear your appearance on a podcast, you need to think about where podcasts are actually being discovered. And what they found is that over 50% of all podcast discovery happens on YouTube, not on podcast apps. So people might see a mention of a podcast on YouTube and then either go and listen to the audio version and subscribe on there. And this holds true whether you're watching the video version afterwards or end up as a subscriber to the audio version. People still discover it more on YouTube. So YouTube is a crucial place clearly for podcast discovery. And I imagine on content discovery as a whole, although this particular research didn't discover that. What else have we got? Just finally to round up, on Thursday, by the way, obviously we've got the launch of Comms Question Time, so I'll talk a little bit more about that. And also I've got a fictional scenario for you, and I'm sure I will see another couple of stories during the week that I want to share with you as well. But just finally, before I wrap up for today, a quick tip from a guest, and it was this one that I pulled out of one of the Comms Question Time shows. And it was this, okay? Telling a story about a product or what you do is not just about giving facts. It's about painting a picture, even creating a taste in someone's mouth with words, so that when you pitch something, you don't just give facts, but paint words or a feeling or an image in people's minds so that they can experience it, such as the delicious melting taste of chocolate when you put that little piece on your tongue and it starts to melt and you get that lift in your brain. You get what I mean? I bet you go out and buy some chocolate now. I'd certainly like some. That's it for the moment. Thanks so much for joining me once again. Really appreciate you listening into the podcast, and I hope you'll find this useful. It is so wonderful to hear from you, by the way, at times. I got a message from someone in Australia and someone in America the other day, and both of them talking about their work in PR, and it's just so nice to hear from you. So always feel free to reach out to me. I am on LinkedIn. My name is Richard Midson, Midson. And to make it sound like I'm concluding this like a podcast, and you have been listening to the Public Relations Podcast, which you can find at thepublicrelationspodcast.com. Speak to you later in the week. Bye.